Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Utility Week podcast. And I'm delighted today to be joined by James Earl, Chief Executive of the Future Energy Networks, and we're going to be discussing all things gas over the next hour. So literally going to be gassing for the rest of this podcast. So James, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, James. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
So I thought we'd start really with a little bit of an explanation for people who aren't familiar with Future Energy Networks, what the organisation does, how it kind of came about, and a little bit about your background and how you came to take up this position. And I believe that it's a fortuitous time for us to talk. I should flag for the listeners that we're talking on the 31st of July. Today, and I believe it's happy birthday is in order, James.
Yes, so it is Future Energy Networks, or FEN as we like to style it. It's our second birthday tomorrow, so I'm expecting cake and candles, please, James. But so yeah, good timing for this conversation. So yes, let me explain some of the background. So we are Future Energy Networks is the membership organisation for the UK's gas networks. So we have National Gas, who own and operate our transmission infrastructure, and the four gas distribution networks, Cadent, Wales and West, SGN and Northern Gas Networks, as our main full members. And we also have the 5 Northern Irish gas networks as associate members as well. We were set up, as I said, 2 years ago. Prior to this, I used to lead the gas work at the Energy Networks Association, the ENA, which used to encompass both gas and electricity. But I think really, if I think back in the history, I think really as a function of the net zero announcement when that was made and when that was brought into law, which really brought into sharp focus what is the future for gas going to be, because we knew then in law that we couldn't have unabated gas in the system in 2050. That meant that so much more of a focus on the future of the gas network and roles for electrification, roles for low carbon gases and things like that. And it just became apparent that the gas networks needed separate representation to really look at what are quite big issues, which I'm sure we will cover in the course of this podcast, and really sort of engage with government and others in the right way. So that's where Future Energy Networks was born from. We are technically a subsidiary of IGEM, the Institution of Gas Engineers and Managers, which obviously brings us closer to that wider gas industry that IGEM represent. And our purpose really is to do exactly as I've said, really, to provide that sharp focus on thinking about what does the future look like for gas networks, and tackling some of these really big questions around what does demand look like into the future, what do we do with the infrastructure that we have into the future as well. So a lot of what we do is working with others in the sector, whether it be with government, with Ofgem, with NESO, others in the sector, and really helping bring together our members with key stakeholders to really tackle some of these big questions. I worked at ENA for a number of years, leading gas work there before I took over the reins at FEN. Prior to that, I was in consultancy for a number of years, working at KPMG, on various different energy strategy, economics, policy, regulation type projects with clients all across the sector. And then before that, my grounding in the sector was actually at Ofgem a number of years ago. So I spent a number of years at the regulator as well. I think the one thing I always like to stress in my career history is that I've worked across both gas and electricity throughout the course of my whole career. Obviously a bit more of a focus on gas now, but I do think it's really, really important as a sector that we do have that. A lot of people in the sector that have that strong understanding across both, because I think that's really how we'll make progress on all the big issues that the sector faces.
Well, we're going to come on to talk about the future of gas, and it's a very again fortuitous time that we're speaking, because we've just had a few big publications from the National Energy System Operator, which we can delve into. But before we talk about the future, I'd just like to focus on the present for a moment, because there is, of course, a really important job that gas networks are performing at the moment. We're a few months in, aren't we, to the current price control, both for transmission and distribution. So what are you hearing back from your members on how that price control has started? in, and what are the kind of day-to-day things that they're focusing on at the moment?
Yeah, so what are we, sort of 4 months in, something to the new price control? Obviously, everyone's taking a bit of a sigh of relief and a bit of a breather between after all of the sort of business planning work and the big effort that's gone into that all round. What does that mean? Throughout the course of leading up to that price control, of course, there were big questions asked about, is this the price control where things change for the gas networks? I think to some extent reality has hit in that we are so reliant on gas in the energy system for a number of different uses, and we are very reliant on our gas infrastructure. And therefore, as we actually move into the price control, there's been a recognition from, I think, everyone really in the sector that this is not a price control of massive change. This is a price control about making sure that our gas infrastructure is invested in appropriately to deliver what it needs to deliver for the energy system in terms of resilience and security of supply, and just purely the sort of volumes of gas that flow through the network today as well. On the distribution side, this is a big price control because this is the price control where the majority of the remainder of the Iron Mains replacement programme will be delivered. And Ofgem has already started talking in terms about this being the last steady state price control. And if you look at it through the lens of the Iron Mains replacement programme, I think that's fair. So a big focus for our distribution members on getting the majority of the remainder of that programme delivered and really sort of modernising the last elements of the distribution system. At transmission level, not the same sort of programme, but a similar sort of story in terms of making sure that there's that continued investment in the asset health of the assets that we have at transmission level, and making sure that the system there is fit for purpose. We are going to need, whatever the future may hold, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, we are going to need gas infrastructure for a long time into the future. And so we must make sure that we have sufficient investment in that infrastructure to keep it safe and to keep it efficient as well. So yes, I mean, I guess in summary on the price control, there were big questions asked through the business planning process, but I think when we actually came to the start of the price control, it became obvious to all that the gas system is still absolutely fundamental to the way our energy system operates. And the key thing is that we have to get investment flowing into it to make sure that it operates in the best way for customers.
And we should mention, when we talk about the price control on the distribution side, of course, that was the only area where Ofgem had any appeals. So all of the distribution networks appealed to the CMA. We won't go into the intricacies of all of the appeals because some of them were quite complex. But the overriding objection, I believe, was around the assumption of productivity across the price control, which also was a big feature in the water appeals, kind of a year before. So do you want to say just a little bit about what the case there was from distribution networks?
Yes. So look, the appeals process is still ongoing, so I won't comment too much on the sort of detail of the merits of the appeal or anything like that. But it's safe to say that productivity has been a long-running issue in our economy more generally, and therefore setting challenging productivity targets for gas networks in a context where productivity is extremely low, unfortunately, across the whole economy, looks difficult. So I think that's the sort of primary thinking behind any sort of appeal in this area. And then yes, if you look at water, where the CMA has sort of opined in a slightly different way on productivity compared to where Ofgem have got to, that is obviously another sort of aspect of the appeal. There's probably not too much more to say than that, James, as things are currently ongoing on that. But I think we should reach an outcome on that fairly soon, I hear.
And so just before we move away from the present, I'm just interested in kind of your role, kind of representing sectors with quite different outlooks for the future, different priorities, but a lot of shared shared issues as well. Is there ever any kind of conflict for you in your role in representing transmission and distribution? Because I know that was that was the case, I think, wasn't it, for the Energy Networks Association? When it was representing both electricity and gas, it's what trade bodies encounter all the time, really, isn't it? That we see that across the sector. But do you ever find any tension between those two parts of the sector that you represent?
I definitely wouldn't use the word conflict. There isn't conflict or really tension in there. There is a lot of shared imperative at transmission and distribution level, whether that be certain programs of work and things with Ofgem or with government, which is exactly the same across transmission and distribution, or where it is look at those big sort of future questions where the two systems are very sort of intermeshed in with each other. I won't sit here and say that therefore transmission and distribution think the same about everything all the time. It doesn't work like that. But I think the big thing really on the gas side is that there is this big question around the future of the overall system. And it has actually, I think I mentioned at the start around, it was net zero that really brought that into sharp focus. I think that has actually also brought the gas industry together to really try and sort of tackle these big questions together and work together and provide the sort of evidence and things into government and others to help drive thinking on this debate forward. So no, it's not something I've seen really during the course of my time leading FEN. And I like to think as well that we've done a decent job in bringing the industry together. As I say, we've got Northern Irish networks as associate members as well. I think it's really important that we have that shared learning and experience to help tackle some of these big questions as well.
Well, let's really flag that there's been some quite important publications over the past couple of days as we speak. So, in particular, National Energy System Operator (NESO) has produced the first of its gas market roadmaps, and has also alongside that put out reports on biomethane, and a very lengthy report on hydrogen, which I confess I haven't managed to get all the way through yet. So, James, you'll explain this much better than me. Do you want to explain what the gas market roadmap is and why NESO is doing this?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start by saying thank you actually to NESO. So they have engaged extensively on these different publications they put out with the gas industry through FEN and through other ways as well. Particularly on the gas markets roadmap, which is an output of their Gas Advisory Council. So that's been a programme of engagement they've had for well over a year now to help them define the shape of that gas markets roadmap. So yeah, I'll start with just saying a thank you to NESO for their engagement and bringing the sector together and really listening to the sector's voices on those. So yes, the gas markets roadmap came out of the work of the Gas Advisory Council, and it is really sort of looking to set out the different aspects of the future of gas that need to be looked at in much more detail in order to set a clearer path and direction for the gas industry over the coming years. So it is really basically launching a programme of work, that gas markets roadmap, to work with NESO to tackle some of these. I'm trying to remember, given it only came out yesterday, I'm trying to remember the different themes. There are 3 themes. One which is really to do with sort of how the markets will evolve as the use of the gas system changes into the future. Obviously, big uncertainties around how fast change may or may not happen on the gas system, and how we make sure that we still have security of supply and resilience throughout that transition. So a really huge part of their work will be looking at that. There's an aspect that's looking at resilience as well, the second theme in there, which is around where we get our supply of gas from currently, and whether there's a case for more storage or more interconnection, whatever it might be, and really looking at that overall resilience picture for the gas system. And then there is a third theme in there that looks more at future opportunities with low carbon gases, whether it be biomethane, hydrogen, or CCS or others as well. So that is NESO's way really of bringing together what will be a programme of work, working with the industry to look at all of these different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, which collectively sum up to, I guess, trying to answer that question of how will the gas system evolve over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and how do we make sure that it does that in the right way for customers as well. So that's that. you asked about the biomethane and hydrogen publications as well. So the NISO, again, another thank you to NISO on biomethane. They have really, really leaned into the work that's been going on in the industry on biomethane over the last year or so, and really helped lead the conversation about this. And the paper that they put out states very clearly that they think biomethane has a really important strategic role to play in the energy system of the future, but the energy system of today as well, and that we can scale biomethane substantially from current levels to deliver that. So a really clear message from NISO, and it's the first time that I've really seen them put out something on a technology that is so clear about their support for that technology. And certainly we'll be pointing out to government that this has been said and they need to take note when thinking about policy in this area. So it's been great working with the NISO team on that through FEN, and also through our work on the Green Gas Task Force, which listeners I'm sure will have heard of as well. And then the final piece they put out on hydrogen was looking at the case for a hydrogen transmission backbone. So this isn't a NISO position, this is a consultancy piece of work that they've commissioned, but really looking at the overall case for a hydrogen transmission backbone in the long run. So a really important moment for the gas industry and NISO, really, which demonstrates that NISO are very much whole systems in the way that they're looking at the future of the energy system. And I think this big publication that shows how much work they're doing on gas really evidences that.
Well, I'm sure they're going to welcome the nice comments. They haven't had many of those in the past couple of weeks, right? So you very nicely set out those kind of three themes of the roadmap. I mean, obviously, the one that has dominated discussion most recently is market resilience, but that's probably the one I want to spend less time on in our conversation, because I think the other two areas are, I think, where you're going to be spending most of your time, and your members are going to have most interest. So, if we talk about the transition, then what's the future for for gas networks? And as you said, it's incredibly uncertain, and it has been for some time. I mean, the predictions that NISO have included, which are based on the future energy scenarios in this report, are wildly different depending on decisions that are made over the next few years. But it seems inevitable that there is going to be change to the gas network. There is going to be elements of decommissioning for the gas networks, and that is inevitably going to mean that the costs of that are ultimately going to fall on fewer and fewer customers unless important decisions are being made at the moment. Ofgem is aware of this in the most recent price control, has talked about accelerated depreciation of new investments, essentially bringing that forward, so customers of today are sharing more of that burden. It's not being left on customers of the future. So these are quite existential questions for the gas networks. I'd like to understand what sort of kind of scenario planning is happening within the networks, and what sort of conversations are going on around these possible futures, and who should bear the costs of any future decommissioning.
Sure. So I guess I'll start by saying that it's absolutely right that NISO are looking at pathways where this could happen over a relatively sort of short to medium term time frame, which might be an odd thing for me to say in some ways. That's because there are pathways out there in the future energy scenarios, as you said, where electrification could happen relatively swiftly, and this needs to be looked at. So it's right that NISO are looking at it. All of the gas networks are looking at those sort of scenarios as well, and what that might mean for demand on their networks, connections on their networks, and how they recover the costs of their investment. DESNZ are looking at this as well through their what was called the midstream review and is now called their gas system in transition program. It's right that we as an industry get ahead of the issue if it becomes an issue, because we can't let it become an issue without some element of sort of planning and foresight there. What I would say, though, is that there is a difference between pathways that are out there, including the future energy scenarios, and what's happening on the ground. So the reality is that the gas networks have more connections to their gas network today than they have disconnections. So while there is this hypothesis, I suppose, that's out there by various different sort of pathways and modelling exercises and things that are out there around declining use of the gas network. The reality is that it is actually growing in terms of connections. That is a marginal, very, very marginal growth when you look at just the big regulated GDNs. But if you add the independent gas transporters into the picture as well, it's actually a reasonable level of growth that's there. So that's not for a minute to say that we shouldn't be, as an industry, looking at the implications of what declining gas use might be and gas connections might be in the years to come. It's just reflective of where we're actually at in the here and now, which does make the job very difficult of trying to determine what is going to happen next and scenario plan around that, because there is a real life scenario that could play out based on where we are now, where actually the gas network doesn't decline over a number of years, and where we're at now continues for a while into the future. So gas networks have to plan around that to make sure we've got the assets in the ground that we need, we've got the right investment going into those assets, and we've got secure supplies of gas. Equally, they do have to plan for another scenario or other scenarios where gas use declines potentially fairly sharply in some scenarios, and we have electrification in various different parts of the system as well. So all of the gas networks are, of course, very, very live to this and doing their own scenario planning and considering what it means for their investors as well, in terms of making sure that they have return on the investments that they make now and that the system needs now, but recognizing that there are some scenarios where those returns may have to be delivered relatively quickly rather than the usual longer asset lifespan that they'd be returned over. So a difficult equation for everyone, but one that networks are very much leaning into with government, with Ofgem, and increasingly with NESO through this work as well.
And what do you think the next steps are? What would be useful for gas networks in terms of just having this kind of open conversation?
I think that's it, actually, James. I think it is that open level of conversation, because it feels to me like loads of people are discussing this, but I actually don't think they are. If you look at the wider energy sector, I think everyone's talking about Clean Power 2030. They're all talking about electricity connections, queues. They're not really talking about what the future of the gas system looks like. I speak to a few sort of specialists and pockets in government and things about this, but it probably does need raising up that profile a little bit more, which I accept is also FEN's job to do as a representative for our members, that we need to be discussing these issues. It also needs government to really take the lead on it as well, and that's what we've seen. I mentioned the midstream review, which has become the gas system in transition programme. That is government's attempt definitely to take a lead on really getting ahead of these issues. We are awaiting a call for evidence from government on network cost recovery, which is effectively looking at this challenge. See, with changing government, that has led to a bit of flux on various things recently. We may well see that before the end of the year. We shall see as things settle down over the summer. But I think the key thing is it needs to have people, the key organisations and decision makers across the sector really looking at these issues in detail. We can, through our members, can help provide the evidence and research and data and things that help feed that process. But it does really need that cross-sector collaboration and focus on that issue.
But we'll come back in a bit to the kind of role of government and how that conversation around gas is changing. It certainly does feel to me like, perhaps you're right, perhaps it's not, it's still not front and centre of the conversation, but it feels like compared to a few years ago, gas is much more part of the conversation. Okay, we'll come back on to that, but just want to talk about disconnections a little bit, because that comes up in the roadmap as well. Now again, with the caveat of lots of uncertainty around, but regardless of the level of it, there are going to be people electrifying the heating over the coming years. There are going to be more and more people getting heat pumps, and each one of those is going to require a disconnection from the gas grid. And at the moment, that seems to be a very disjointed process. So the roadmap talks about the two ways in which currently customers can do that, either through their supplier, or they can come directly to the gas network. But I suppose you have this this situation, don't you, where you're having individual properties disconnected at quite a cost, which is then going onto the bill. In some cases, this is going to require, roads being dug up, or various different disruption. And I suppose there's every chance that then you finish that work 3 weeks later. Number 48 is having a heat pump. You've got to come back and do it all again. Is there a better way to look at disconnections?
So I know you didn't say this, James, but I'll make this point clear at the start to listeners that even though the two words begin with D, they're not the same thing. Disconnections and decommissioning. You mentioned decommissioning earlier. Yeah. It's a point we are very keen to stress that, of course, there will be disconnections from the gas network. There are always disconnections from the gas network. There have always been disconnections from the gas network. It is a natural process, as is the connections process currently. That doesn't automatically lead you to a point where there is decommissioning, because to decommission assets on the gas system, you have to have all of the customers that use those assets off that system until the very last customer leaves. We have an obligation. The networks need to obviously provide a service to supply those customers with that gas. So I know you didn't say this, James, but just to make that distinction clear for listeners, it's absolutely right that we look at disconnections, and the policy that exists, I think, is relatively clear, but it probably isn't fit for purpose into the future, particularly if we do see an acceleration in disconnections in the coming years. We need to make sure that disconnections process works in the right way for customers and is the most overall efficient thing for the system as well. So first thing to say is that gas networks are fully behind looking at this in more detail, are engaging extensively with Ofgem, with government and with NESO and others about this issue to help them to review disconnections arrangements and make them fit for purpose into the future. I think your point on, I think if I may sort of summarise, if this is done in an ad hoc way rather than in a more planned way, that could lead to higher cost than is needed.
Higher cost and higher disruption.
Higher cost and higher disruption than we really want to have is absolutely true. And so we do need to work out disconnections arrangements which can tie these things together. Can customers in a street who are all disconnecting be disconnected at the same time? How do we share the cost of disconnection as well? This is a big issue. If customers are disconnecting from the gas network, is it right that the customers that remain on the gas network pay for that disconnection? That might be a minor problem currently because those costs are spread over quite a big customer base, but if disconnections were to accelerate into the future, it does become quite a major issue and potentially quite a major distributional issue in terms of the demographics of people who might be disconnecting versus not. I think one thing I would say on this, though, is a slight note of caution that I think we should be trying to coordinate, definitely, to be more efficient, both in terms of cost and disruption in other areas for people. I don't think we are in a world, though, where we can have a government or a system planner or someone that dictates to individual households exactly what they do at any one time. We're in a world these days where the customer is king, really. The customer who is also a voter as well is king or queen. And therefore, I can't imagine a scenario where we are saying, okay, 80% of this street is moving over to electrification. We're going to need to do something to get the remaining 20% off. You could maybe incentivize that change to happen. I can't see a world where we mandate that change happening. So I think that's not to say that we shouldn't be looking at the disconnections process and looking at how we can make it as efficient as possible. But I think there needs to be some sort of real world reality over that in terms of there will be limits to the extent in which they're able to do that. And there may be instances where you're able to disconnect 9 out of 10 houses on a street, but one house just remains on gas, and maybe they end up disconnecting in 10, 20, 30 years time, and we have to come back and dig up the road again then. There's a practical reality over all this stuff as well.
Yeah, it's very much an asterisk of goal kind of scenario, isn't it? Are there I suppose the other way of looking at it is, are there technical solutions to allow properties to stay connected to the gas grid safely, while they are electrified. Is that something that any research is going into, or is it just the health and safety implications mean that there has to be a disconnection?
No, I mean, there's a difference between just sort of capping the gas supply and then actually physically taking all the gas pipes out of the ground. So at the moment, I mean, there's no reason why you can't just, if you fully electrify a property, why you couldn't just cap the gas supply. And if they decided 5 years down the line, actually, this isn't working for me, I'd like to go on gas again, please, then there's no reason why you couldn't do that. Of course, once you take all the pipes out the ground, that's it done. So, but yeah, there's no reason. I suppose we probably will come into this later in the podcast anyway, but there are also ways in which you can electrify but also keep your gas supply and use your gas supply still, but you predominantly electrify, so hybrid heat pumps being the main example of these, and stand to benefit. So electrification doesn't have to be a binary thing. It doesn't have to be you either remain on gas or you electrify everything and you come off gas. You could electrify a significant amount of your demand but still use gas for meeting peaks, for resilience, or for cost purposes as well.
Right, let's move on. Conscious of time, there's so much to discuss, but wanted to spend a good chunk of our discussion talking about biomethane, because it's something that you spent a lot of your time thinking about. And as you say, this is this report from NESO. Really goes into depth about this, and and it has been supportive of the potential uses for biomethane. Although there are kind of important differences in the way that you've talked about biomethane and the way NESO have talked about it. But just before we get into that. Do you want to just give an overview of where you see the potential for biomethane over the coming years?
Yeah, of course. So there's been a lot of work done on this in the last really couple of years through a group that we've brought to life called the Green Gas Task Force, which brings together a number of membership organisations and trade associations with the gas networks and around 10 to 15 of the biggest biomethane producers out there. And I hope that has changed the conversation a little bit around a gas that was sort of silently contributing to the energy system without many people knowing about it for a number of years. We have 11 terawatt hours of capacity connected to the network currently, with capacity to heat over 1 million homes from that. And yet most people, I think, in the sector, hope it's changing, but in the past, most people not really know what it is or what it's doing. So we've been trying to build that profile, and one of the key things we've been trying to do is really establish what is the scale and potential for this sector. So I mentioned 11 terawatt hours of capacity connected to the network currently. We've done a key piece of work through the Green Gas Task Force, which shows that we could produce 120 terawatt hours of, and this is a very key point, fully sustainable biomethane by 2050. Now that's, I think, something like 17-18% of current gas demand, which is a decent amount. But if you think that gas demand may well change in the future and may well fall into the future, that figure becomes really, really interesting. If you couple that with other low carbon gases, hydrogen, and CCS, you can imagine a world where biomethane can play a really important role as a mixture of different low carbon molecules at decarbonising the gas system alongside increased electrification as well. So I think that work that we've done, that is, I would say, is sort of super credible and done by the best in the business in terms of the analysts looking at that, has really helped move the conversation forward. NESO have really leaned into the conversation with us, and they've had a similar piece of work, I know, done looking at this. The report that they've put out stops short of endorsing 120 terawatt hours as the figure, but says quite clearly that we could scale from where we are today to around 30 terawatt hours, which you're looking at sort of enough gas to heat around sort of 3 million homes-ish at that point, which is substantial. Relatively easily without entering the world of sort of trade-offs or risks or dependencies that would need looking at. They say that beyond that level, so once you get up from 30 on to sort of 100, 120, you start having to think more seriously, I suppose, around the trade-offs in terms of where it might be sort of land use trade-offs, or getting into that conversation about energy versus food and things like that. We think there is a lot to go at in that area. We think we can scale to over 100 terawatt hours of fully sustainable biomethane using techniques like rotational cropping or sequential cropping, which means that you're not actually taking land out of production of food. In fact, you're actually benefiting land that is used by food by improving the quality of the soils of that land. You're not taking other land out of use to produce biomethane. You can do it fully sustainably, but still produce over 100 terawatt hours of the stuff. So I think when NISO has come to on it, and the report they've done is fantastic, because I hope it really propels the conversation forward, hearing our independent experts in the industry really back the technology. I do think we can go further as well. And I think that will become apparent in the coming years, just how important biomethane is going to be to the system, and how it is not just a sort of marginal contributor, but it can be a pillar of our energy system in the same way that offshore wind is, or in the same way that solar is becoming, for example.
It talks about some barriers to biomethane. It's they've done some interviews for this report with producers. One of the things that was brought up was the time it takes to get a connection to the grid, and I know that's something that the networks and FEN is working on. So what is the problem there, and what are the potential solutions to that?
Yeah, I think, speaking candidly, the problem on this really is that over the course of time, we've had different connections processes for the different GDNs and national gas as well. And biomethane has been seen as a sort of small contributor to the overall picture in terms of gas. As it's become clearer how fundamental it could be to the future gas system, I know I speak for all 4 GDNs and national gas in saying that they're all looking very seriously at their connections process to see, how can we expedite this? How can we make it cost effective to connect to the network as well, and trying to get this green energy into the network as swiftly as we can? So it's not easy, and we obviously have to make sure that the connections process maintains resilience of the system and security of supply and safety above all else. But there are examples in other countries, for example in France, where they have a right to connect effectively, which means it pushes the onus onto the networks to really get producers connected wherever they want to effectively to the network. There are examples out there of people doing it, countries doing it really, really well. We as networks want to learn from that and also work together to, where we can, harmonise processes, but also just make sure those individual processes are as quick as possible. Bit of a plug, we've got a grouping called the Green Gas Technical Forum, which brings together the producers with all of the gas networks together to really, so it's not a case of the gas networks imposing a connections process on the producers. It's actually a shared endeavour. We're working together with the industry and saying, right, what needs to change about the way in which sites are connected into the network, and how can we bring that collective expertise across the industry to make those changes happen? So a lot's going on in this area, and a real drive from everyone to try and expedite those connections processes as fast as we can. But I should say as well, connections are not an issue that is unique to the gas side of the energy system.
Really? I don't remember anyone talking about that. What are you referring to, James?
Actually, biomethane connections are relatively swift compared to other parts of the system.
In your response to the biomethane report, you did point out that NISO hasn't kind of explicitly talked about biomethane for heat. So do you want to say a little bit more about what you'd like to hear from NISO on that point?
Yeah, so I can see why they didn't, because they had a sort of limited time to deliver what they delivered, and had to keep the scope relatively narrow. And heat is a tricky question. As soon as you add that into the scope, you probably broaden out to all sorts of different things. So I can understand why. However, the beauty of biomethane, and I guess many ways the sort of challenge of biomethane, is it can be used for lots of different end uses. And in fact, today a lot of it does go towards heat through decarbonising the gas supply that goes into heat. So I think any analysis that excludes heat, as NISO have done, misses part of that picture. And there are many out there saying, well, biomethane needs to be reserved for power, because we're going to need low carbon gas for power, or it needs to be reserved for industry because, again, there are certain parts of industry that aren't going to be able to electrify. It's also true that you can get the biggest negative emissions benefit in certain end uses like power and industry as well, by being able to capture not just pre-combustion CO2 from the biomethane process, but also after you burn it using CCS to capture it as well. So I understand the logic of why they might be looking at some end uses more than others, but the heat question is really, really difficult. And the reality is we are nowhere near where we need to be in decarbonising homes to keep us on track to hit our carbon targets, our carbon budgets, and net zero by 2050. I feel that something is going to have to change with our heat policy at some point if we are ever going to get that on track. And that's not to say that the current solutions that are pushed, predominantly heat pumps, heat networks as well, aren't going to be a major part of that puzzle. They are. But I do think we need to broaden out our thinking and include things like hybrid heat pumps and potentially biomethane as part of that picture as well. We put out a report through the Green Gas Task Force, which looked at biomethane hybrids, which looked at using an electric heat pump for most of your heat demand and then using biomethane for that small residual when it's particularly cold or the system is particularly stressed as well. We think they could have a really important role to play. We're not going to ever be able to produce enough biomethane to heat every home with biomethane. That is absolutely not what anyone is advocating for in the gas networks or in the Green Gas Task Force. But could biomethane have a role to play, particularly in hybrid systems, in those really hard to electrify homes that are particularly difficult to retrofit or difficult to electrify for a number of other reasons as well?
And I guess one of the counter points to that is that one of the things that has been challenging about the heat pump rollout is simply the kind of the faff factor and the expense of doing that. You'd still be going through a lot of that to have a hybrid heat pump. So isn't that just kind of deterring people from going for that full electrification route, but still having some of the disruption in order to get a separate system?
I'd argue actually the disruption is much less, because with a hybrid system, I think that there are lots and lots of benefits that I could wax lyrical about, but the biggest benefit to me is about when people and why people replace their heating system. Most of the time, you replace your heating system as a distressed purchase when it comes into winter and, my boiler's broken. And you might have been thinking a little bit or doing a bit of research about heat pumps, but when it actually comes to it and your house is cold, you think, I'm just going to get a boiler. I need to get it in as quickly as possible. A hybrid heat pump does really help to overcome that distressed purchase situation, because naturally, as a hybrid, you combine both a boiler and an electric heat pump at the same time. So you can still have that boiler in situ, it's still there, and you just bring in the hybrid element to the system whenever suits you, I suppose. That, to me, is probably the most compelling reason, because it overcomes that issue. And the reality with hybrids as well is you don't need the same level of changes to things like pipework and radiators and retrofitting of insulation and things that you tend to need with fully electric heat pumps. So I would say I don't think the faff factor, as you said, James, is anywhere near as high. And it could be a really appealing aspect of hybrids that you're able to adopt a low carbon or a lower carbon heating system that puts you on that pathway to be able to say, okay, this works pretty well. Maybe next time I do it, I'll get rid of the gas boiler and I'll go to my fully electric heat pump. So I think there's lots to go after in that area for sure.
Just want to talk a little bit about the kind of support schemes for things like biomethane. So the green gas support scheme has been really important so far, hasn't it? But I believe that applications for that cut off in a couple of years' time. So there presumably are discussions ongoing about what is the next steps for support. What do you and what do your members want to see?
Yeah, so this is very topical and is getting to quite a serious situation actually. So end of March 2028 is the cut-off for the Green Gas Support Scheme after it was extended by a couple of years last year. That is not far away at all when you're having to think about
No.
future planning and actually kind of planning and financing and getting a final investment decision for projects. There has been quite a rush recently of projects that have applied into funding from government because they've heard from government that the funding pot was running out. So actually, I'm not sure if that has got to a point of fully running out now, but there's been quite a push to get projects into that system now, which is great because it means we could have quite a glut of projects coming online in the next few years. It is a problem because we are reaching that cliff edge where the funding isn't there. We don't know what's going to replace the Green Gas Support Scheme in 2028. And if you're going to be thinking about how you plan and finance a project now, it's a tricky context to be doing it in. And so what we've been pushing government for all along through their process of designing the future framework for biomethane support is it needs to be ambitious. So it needs to recognise the evidence that's out there on the extent to which the sector can scale. It needs to unlock all the different values of biomethane. So at the moment, the support that's out there is a relatively blunt instrument, and it's just a tariff scheme that provides an additional payment, which makes it sort of biomethane broadly in the region of natural gas in terms of price. But it doesn't help to unlock any of those additional benefits of biomethane in terms of the biogenic CO2, which can be used for greenhouse gas removals, or the digestate from the process that can be used to displace artificial fertilizer. It's not sophisticated enough to do that. So the other thing we've been pushing for is we want to see a long-term scheme that provides certainty to the industry, helps unlock all these different value streams, which over time will also bring the cost of biomethane down by being able to unlock all these different sort of side values, so to speak, of the gas. So this is what we've been pushing government at for a while now. It feels like it is getting relatively quite close to a crisis point where we need to hear from government on what that future framework is going to look like. It's much delayed, unfortunately. We were originally told it would be the back end of last year, and when we're now we'll be looking at sort of October, I think, at the earliest now to hear something from government. But in the absence of government really setting their stall out and ideally having the sort of ambitious support framework that I've set out, there is a real risk of a cliff edge for the industry, which won't help anyone ultimately, because it's a low carbon energy form that we have today that is decarbonising our energy system today. We should be making the most of that and getting as much in the system as we can.
Let's take this opportunity then to talk about government. So obviously we have a new government now, or at least we have a change in Prime Minister and several of the key roles, including Energy Secretary with Beata Fambulla coming back into the department, having previously been a minister. Now they inherit the government at a time where there are a lot of questions that need to be answered around gas, as we've talked about, over our conversation so far. A lot of publications that we're expecting, including that that long-awaited decision, if decision is what it ultimately ends up being, on hydrogen for heating, but lots of other things that we've talked about, including the future of the Green Gas Support Scheme. Now, I know it's early days, James, but what sort of sense have you got from the new administration of their kind of approach to gas and their willingness to engage?
It is very early days. So it is very difficult to provide a sort of very, very clear view on that. Certainly on the North Sea, you can see potentially there may be a softening of position on that, which may indicate a direction of travel. Equally, I think the focus on Clean Power 2030 will remain. I don't see anything that will really sort of shift that position. We obviously have a Secretary of State that used to be a minister under Ed Miliband's leadership. So, and that was a key part of the manifesto, the Clean Power mission, and one of their kind of key missions as government. So I don't see in the short term that really changes things significantly for the gas sector. I think what might become apparent fairly soon, though, is just how overdue some of these things are, and how much, even if this government isn't planning to lean into gas issues more than the previous, there needs to be some clarity provided to industry on a number of these things. So the biggest, most obvious probably is the hydrogen strategy, which is, and now I've lost count of how delayed it is. It is very, very, very delayed, and government keep reiterating to the industry that they fully support the sector. But the reality is that the sector is really struggling in the absence of that strategy to justify continued investment in the UK, and is definitely looking at other jurisdictions, I'm sure. So regardless of what that strategy says, we need to have that as a sector soon, or we risk effectively really, really cutting short an industry that will be an important part of the net zero picture. Different views are available on the extent to which hydrogen will be part of the picture, but it has to be part of the picture in some way if we're going to get to net zero. I think that's probably the biggest example, but there are other things. The biomethane future framework, as I mentioned, much delayed. The hydrogen for heat decision is an interesting one that has gone very, very, very quiet out of government. Whether we do hear anything on that, we shall see. Other things I've mentioned as well, like the gas system and transition program, where calls for evidence that they were going to put out, and things like cost recovery, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, again delayed. So to answer your question, James, I don't think there are any signs from the new administration of a fundamental change in approach where they're suddenly going to put gas issues as the most important thing on the agenda. But I do think it will become apparent before long, as ministers start really getting into their slightly changed briefs, that we can't leave this uncertainty hanging over the gas sector for too much longer.
So it might be a kind of early days with the government, but for Ofgem, which I suppose also has new leadership, and obviously the adverts are out for a new CEO. But in terms of Ofgem's approach to the gas networks, now it again has some important decisions to make on thinking about the next price control, what that would look like, what its approach to regulating gas looks like. Now, I appreciate a lot of that depends on what they hear from government and this kind of strategic steer they hear from them. But I'd just like to get your view on what you're hearing from Ofgem, and if you've got any kind of reflections on the recent DESNZ review of Ofgem, which kind of gave it some kind of strategic steers for the future. Whether you felt that gave enough emphasis to gas issues.
So I think I mentioned earlier in the podcast that Ofgem have said that they expect GD3 to be the sort of last steady state price control for gas networks. And I think the primary reason for that is the Iron Mains replacement programme. And that is a thing that will mean there is a fundamental shift for the next price control. Regardless of what gas demand is doing, there will be a shift in this sort of investment profile that needs to be considered. So I think that sets the tone, and I think that means that the conversations about RIIO-4 and that sort of strategizing that comes before the business planning, that comes before the actual price control, will probably happen pretty early this time. Will be happening really starting almost now-ish. 5 years disappears pretty fast, unfortunately. So that will happen soon. There are things that Ofgem is doing actively right now that are sort of leaning into those sort of gas issues that we've been talking about. So disconnections, for example, big program of work looking at that very actively, that we as gas networks are leaning into very hard. On biomethane as well, there's an allowance that has been set out in GD3 of £20 million per licence area to be used on to basically help connect projects to the grid in those areas through reinforcement and other ways in which we can provide capacity for those. So I think there are some near-term things that Ofgem are clearly focused on to help near-term gas issues, which is how do we improve the customer experience if they disconnect away from gas? How do we get more low-carbon gas into the system? So all really good stuff. I don't think it will be long at all before the conversation turns towards that more strategic view of what does RIIO-4 look like, particularly when you've got that changing investment profile into the gas distribution networks. There will, of course, be questions raised around, well, what happens if we have a huge change in use of the gas network during that RIIO-4 period, and significant disconnection or whatever it may be as well. So yeah, I don't think it will be long before those conversations start up again. The Ofgem review, I don't think it really changes anything massively specifically for gas. I know that review came out with sort of thoughts on Ofgem's duties and how they balance their duties across current consumers and future consumers and the economy and all the rest of it. Ofgem's enforcement powers as well and what they can do in that area. I don't think specifically it really changes anything for the gas sector over and above for the electricity sector as well.
Right, conscious of time, there's one big topic that we haven't discussed yet. So the last time we saw each other was at our data center demand conference back in early July, at which obviously connections were a big topic, and we've had further publications on demand connections since then. Now the role of gas in this, has been discussed before, but it's one that's definitely worth delving into again, because I know, and it's briefly mentioned, I think, in the gas market roadmap, that GasNet was increasingly getting requests from data centers who've been unable to connect to the electricity grid to have their own on-site gas generation. So, just tell us what you're hearing in terms of those requests and how networks are able to respond to that.
Yeah, so we put out figures recently that said that over the course of 2024 and 2025, the gas networks had 113 inquiries about connection for data centers. I should stress that isn't 113 different data centers. That is 113 inquiries in relation to connecting connecting data centers up to gas. And look, some of those will definitely be speculative. We shouldn't expect all of those to proceed, but the trend is there for everyone to see. I think the really important part about that data as well is that we had 3 times as many inquiries in 2025 compared to 2024. This is a growing trend that doesn't look like it's going to go away anytime soon. And the primary reason for that, and I know from speaking to a number of the developers who've been putting in requests as well, is the challenges with connecting to the electricity system. And it's the quotes they're being in receipt of 10, 12, 15 years to connect, which just is completely incompatible with what they're trying to do with their data centers. The gas system, on the other hand, that could be for a relatively simple connection, somewhere 6 to 12 months. It could spread into a few years, but the key thing is that we don't think that it's a blocker. We think the time frames where of building out a data center would roughly align or perhaps be longer than the time frames of connecting into the gas system. So those things together are a big part of why this is being looked at. It was really interesting at your conference recently, and thank you for inviting me to speak at that. I spoke at, I think it's about midday-ish, something like that. And I sat through very interesting morning sessions, but I didn't hear the word gas spoken. And then when I spoke on the panel and obviously talked to her all about data centers and interest in gas, we then had a Q&A session afterwards, and you had one of those lectern type things that's in front of you, and you can see the questions that are coming in on the system. Almost everyone was asking about gas. So actually, it's a bit of an unspoken truth at the moment that not all, but a lot of the developers that are out there are really considering gas connections, but a little bit afraid of really talking about it too much publicly because they understand the optics around that and some of the challenges around that. Our view, and we put out plenty of stuff through FEN that I'd encourage listeners to go and take a look at, is that there can be very much a great, pragmatic, sensible middle ground that makes the best use of both our gas infrastructure and our electricity infrastructure side by side. We're not talking about a suite of massive data centers all connecting in to use unabated gas. We're talking about the idea of connecting into gas for a proportion of demand, potentially connecting in to electricity for the maximum capacity they can possibly get at that point in time, reusing waste heat, solar PV, batteries and things on site as well, but using gas to for resilience purposes or to meet the energy demand that they're not quite able to get from the electricity networks as well. That sort of whole system model, I think, is going to be the best way in which we can capitalize on the benefits of data centers and AI in terms of jobs and growth and defense and security and things like that as well, while also not completely sort of sacrificing our climate ambitions as well. A key point that I will always make on this as well, which is a bit of a source of frustration to me, is that when you talk about data centers and gas, people assume that means fossil fuels. We talked about biomethane at length on the podcast already. There's absolutely no reason why these data centers can't be using green molecules instead of green electrons to fuel their service. I know that a number of them are looking at this. I met a developer yesterday and was speaking to them at length about this. So I think there has to be a degree of pragmatism which this challenge is looked at. We're going to need data centers and AI. The electricity system is not going to be able to take all of them in the near-term timeframe that we want to have them into the system. But there are these good whole system models that can incorporate green gases alongside green electrons, and that can really sort of work out well for the overall energy system. I suppose the last thing I will say on it as well is I actually think there could be a real opportunity to invest in the energy system and provide that investment that the system's going to need. So as an example, we know for clean power, whether that's by 2030 or later than that we are going to need gas in some form, whether that be green gas or a certain amount, 5% of unabated gas. But there are gas assets on our system that are used for power that have been around a number of years and will need replacing at some point. Why can't we get the data centers to invest in gas assets that they use for their own purposes over time as the electricity network is reinforced and they're able to get more and more of their electricity from the grid? Suddenly you've got brand new assets that have been invested in that can be used to help balance the power system as well. So I think I'd like the conversation to mature more around this in the sector, to be seeing gas infrastructure as a great enabler of AI and data centers, and also them being a real opportunity to provide the investment into the system to help decarbonize as well.
Right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground there, James. So thank you very much for your time today. I think we're going to leave it there. But I'm sure we'll be carrying on the discussion further. Just a little plug that on the 25th and 26th of November, Utility Week Forum will be returning in London, and we will be discussing the future of the gas network. We'll be looking at future price controls. We'll be looking at a whole systems approach to the energy transition across those 2 days. So please do look out for your tickets there. But for now, I will say thank you very much to James, and hope to catch up with you again soon.